Alright, so in the last video we saw how generators help us handle async code in a way simpler manner than you would traditionally write with promises. And at this point, if you're wondering that if what if you use Redux Thunk with async await, and how does that entire model compare with using generators and Redux Saga, I'd like to point out a few things. There are a few fundamental differences in the way you write. You do async programming with generators and the way you do async programming with um, async await. So if you're using generators, we already know that generators don't run to completion, but async await code will, because that's just normal function. And by by having these functionality, there is an inversion of control, because we can also feed data into our generators, and that way we can decide the flow of transactions if you're building a complex or a mildly complex application. So, without further ado, we will start with how setting up this app in this video, and we'll also take a look at the base setup of Redux Saga and how we can go ahead and build this application. So, if you want to follow along, there is this project hosted at on GitHub at wjs-wordpress/, and you can check out the branch called starter, and this is basically a base set of the entire project, which will simply render what I'll just show you. So if I run localhost 3000, so with this base project you will get a simple app that renders this grid, and what's happening here is pretty simple. If I go into my image grid component, you can see that I'm making a fetch request to the Unsplash API, and um, simply rendering the images in a grid. So this is what we are starting with. We'll first set up Redux here, and then introduce Redux Saga into the entire ecosystem. So yeah, to set up Redux, if you're already familiar with setting up Redux and you don't want to invest time in it, you can skip ahead to the next video where we'll look at Saga. But for those of you who want to see how can they go about setting up the Redux store, they can stay here. All right, so I'll start with having constants for my actions, if only I can spell it right. Yeah, and all right, that's a mistake. File index.js. So I'm going to have a couple of constants, but they will initially start with everything around images. So one will contain images underscore load. This will signify that there is a loading of image which is in progress, and another one will be load success, images load success, and another one to identify the failure. So it should be images load fail. I'll simply export them from here. So these are my constants that will help us signify the actions and watching them in reducers. So the next step is to add another file which will contain all the actions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called actions, which has index.js file which will contain all the actions that I'll be dispatching around images. So first I'm going to go ahead and import the constants that I had from /constants, and can write one action for that will signify the loading of images, and it will simply return a type of images dot load. Another one will be for success. So it's pretty obvious that whenever I call this action, I will have images with me. So I'll need to set it into the store, and that I can call it as images.load success, and I'll also send the images with this action. And another one will be set error in case the request fails or there's an issue. I should be able to handle it with type images.load just.load underscore fail. Yep. And another one, okay, and I'll dispatch an error. So I can now export all the actions from here as load images, set images, and set error. So that marks for the actions. Next step is to add reducers, which is pretty important. So I can create a folder called reducers / index.js, and I will first start with writing image reducers. There's going to be 3 layers in my reducers. One is to signify the loading state, another one to contain all the images, and the other one to contain all the errors. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file here. I'm going to call it images reducer.js, which will contain all the action handling. For whenever an action gets dispatched, this reducer should be able to handle all the requests. So this is what it will look like. I have basically imported the images actions from my constants, and whenever the action type matches the load success, I will simply add whatever I get in my actions, which is basically images that we just saw here. I'll just simply add it to my state, and that's it for images reducer. Another one will be loading reducer. Now this will contain the loading state of my entire application, and this is what it will look like. So I have a loading reducer which sets the loading whenever I dispatch an action called images.load, and anytime I fire a success or a fail error, a success or a fail action, loading will be set to false. Otherwise, it will just simply return the default state or the current state. And the next one we have here is for storing the errors. So I can go ahead and create a new file here called error reducers.js, and it will basically just simply store the error that I'm sending on load fail action into my state. So now that we have all of our reducers in place, I can go ahead and create a root reducer which will combine all these reducers together. So I'm going to go ahead and import loading reducer here from /loading reducer, and simply same thing for my images reducer and the error reducer. Since I need to now combine these, so I'm gonna import combine reducer from my Redux library, and then I'm going to export a root reducer from here, which will simply combine all these reducers together and create the store as first one for loading, which will be represented with this key called is loading, and another one for images handled by images reducer, and error by error reducer. I can export it from here. Cool. It seems that we now have actions constants and reducers in place, now we can go ahead and set up our store in our app.js. So since we are wrapping this with a div, we will simply need a provider component for our store to be accessible in all the children components. So I can just do provider, import provider from Redux, React Redux actually, and I will also need to configure the store here. So I think it's best if I do it in a separate directory in case we plan on testing with a blank store later. So I'm going to go ahead and create another folder called store, which will simply contain a file that will just instantiate my store for me. So index.js, which will basically import create store from Redux, and it will also import root reducer, which we just created in our reducer folder from /reducers, and we will also need I guess apply middleware, since okay, we don't want to set that right now. Okay, so that's it for now, and we can just now create a store, and we can call it with configure store. So function that will just simply return us our store, and create it by create store, which will take our root reducer, and we will also set up this really handy plugin for Redux DevTools to monitor the Redux state easily and see if actions are being dispatched properly. So I think it's Redux DevTools _ extension. Note that you need to have this extension installed if you haven't used it already, and if you don't want to use it, you can skip this. It's not necessary, but it's just really handy for development. I guess that's it. Yeah, so I can now return my store from here and export this entire thing from this file. Configure store from here. So inside my app.js, I can now import configure store and pass it and create a store in my app and then pass it to my provider. So I'm going to go ahead and import configure store from my store, and then I'll just simply create my store with configure store. If only I can type this, yeah. And then inside my provider, I'm going to pass my store. My bad. I guess we don't have Redux installed in this project, so I guess I may have forgotten to run yarn add Redux. Hopefully this should work now. Okay, combined reducers is not a part of Redux. So you're seeing this error here. It's disappeared. Okay, this got auto imported, it seems. We're gonna get rid of this. Okay, so I have some issue in my app. Excellent. Okay, I think it's because my provider component should always take only one child, so we can drag this in fragment and move this here and import fragment from React. Yep, that works. And I guess we can test our extension as well if I fix this bug here. Okay, and so we have our extension working properly. We can check the state. It has is loading, images, and error. Everything is set to default, nothing fancy going on. And we can actually go ahead and connect our image grid component with Redux Store. So I can go into my components and import connect from React Redux. And I guess connect this component. Okay. Connect image grid. This will take two arguments. First one will be map state to props, and the second one will be map dispatch to props. For now it will be null. And I'll just create const map state to props, and it will be a function that returns this object, which will have is loading, images, error, and I can destructure it from my state variable, which I will be getting in the arguments. Is loading, images, and error. I guess if I go ahead and check the props of my image grid component, I should see all these props listed here. Yep, so I'm now getting the errors, images, and is loading state in my component. Next, we'll look how we can handle. We'll look at how we can handle these things and how we can manipulate the store from my component and go further. We'll also look at how we can set up the Redux Saga into our project, and yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for this video. See you in the next one.